Jill and welcome to my channel. If you're new here, thank you for coming, thank you for clicking. I hope you like and subscribe to my videos. Today is going to be one that's probably something maybe you've heard of. It's called the Candyman. Now, don't get that confused with the Candyman in the movie. That's not the same thing. This is the real Candyman. And believe it or not, I grew up very near where all this took place. It's a really awful, terrifying story that you grew up hearing about, but you always thought that didn't really happen, or you would hear bits and pieces of it and think, you know, my mom's being paranoid. She doesn't want me to go out. She doesn't want me to play. And, you know, not until recently did I realize that, oh my gosh, this was a real story. And they had really good reason for trying to be very protective of us. So we're going to cover Dean Quarle, the real Candyman. If you're interested in this story, then stick around. Okay, Dean Arnold Quarle was born on Christmas Eve 1939. He was born in Fort Wayne, Indiana. He would be the first child of Arnold Edward Quarle and Marie Robinson. They had different last names, but they were married. Dean, he was a very sickly little boy. He went undiagnosed with a case of rheumatic fever throughout his very young years. So in school, he was kind of a loner. He was the pale boy. He didn't interact much because he wasn't allowed to be in social activities at school. He wasn't allowed to participate in PE or any extracurricular activities at that point in his life, so he didn't have a whole lot of friends. His parents would divorce once and then remarry again, and this would lead to them having Dean's younger brother. So once again, they got together. They had Dean's younger brother named Stan. Okay, so after having Stan, what happens? They divorce again. The mom takes custody of the boys and moves them down to Texas. In Texas, she goes about opening this candy shop in her garage. Okay, so they moved to this small town in Vidor, Texas. They open a candy shop. Okay, and it is run out of their garage. Dean, he would do the candy store. He was great at making the candies, doing the orders, and he would go to school. But he would He would come straight from school to go back and work in this candy factory. Well, his mother remarried to a guy named Jim West, I believe. Let's see. Jake West in 1955. Jake West happened to be a traveling salesman. Okay, so Jake West married his mother, and they came up with the perfect gig. Like, he was a traveling salesman, so he would take the candy on the road with him and sell the candy as well. And so then the business started kind of picking up. So they said, you know, we're living in Vidor, Texas, but all the big businesses taking place in Houston. So they moved up their family and they moved to the Heights in Houston, Texas. This is where they're going to open the doors to a candy store that boys and girls and young kids can come in and look and buy candy. I mean, what a better way to get kids to come in, right? So Dean, of course, he's working at this candy store. He's in high school. In high school, they said he was still just as awkward. He played the trombone and he liked the candy store. Those were his two things. They said he had a few girlfriends, but he wasn't really, you know, dating girls. He was just still socially awkward. So in 1960, Dean went home to Indiana to stay with his grandma. His grandma had been recently widowed. So he went back to Indiana to stay with his grandma, and he stayed with his grandma from 1960 to 1962. It was there that he did meet a girl and dated her. And it was said that the girl proposed to him and he turned her down. And then he eventually came back in 1963 back to Houston to once again help his mom with the candy store. In 1964, Dean was drafted into the Army. Dean was said to be an amazing soldier. He hated the Army, but yet he followed the rules and he was exemplary. However, he got honorably discharged, I believe, after just 10 months in the Army, because he said that it was a hardship where his mom needed him to come home and help with the candy store. His mom had just recently divorced her second husband. So they let him out and he got to come home, and he was given the job of vice president. And at this time, it was called, I can't even remember, Pecan Praline maybe, the candy store. Nevertheless, he came home and he was back to doing what he did. He rented the apartment above the candy store and he ran the candy shop. This is where we know that this story gets dark. Now keep in mind, to this day, people are still coming out saying things about this story from the 70s, okay? So this is how it all began. Now I'm going to use some abbreviations because you can't say certain words on YouTube. So you're going to have to kind of figure out what I'm saying with some abbreviations, things like that. So I'm going to go ahead and get into it now. So in 1967, 12-year-old David Owen Brooks would come in contact with Dean Arnold Quarle. David Owen Brooks would be coming to the candy store. David Owen Brooks lived with his father. His mother was not in the picture. And it was said that his father was very abusive to him. He was a very lonely boy. He would be made fun of. He wore awkward glasses and things like that. He was basically a forgotten child. Nobody really looked after him, and all his dad did was make fun of him. So this was the perfect time for Dean to come into this little boy's life and make him feel special, build him up so he could eventually use him, is what he did. He used him to lure young boys to his home. Okay, so he took a couple of years. He would befriended him. He moved David Owen Brooks into his home. He would buy him gifts. He would take him places. And David Owen Brooks come to see him as a father figure. So Dean got it into his mind that he was going to tell David Owen Brooks this story, that he was in a trafficking ring, and that if he brought him boys in for him to play and have fun with, he would pay him. He wasn't going to hurt the boys. He just liked to have fun with them. Now, in his mind at this time, I think he was around 14 years old. So keep in mind, I'm not making excuses for him, but he didn't really know that how adults were to treat their young sons, I guess. I'm not trying to make excuses here. So anyway, this starts happening. He starts bringing in his friends for Dean Quarle to play with, okay? And this happens for a while. One day, he brings in a friend, and that friend is, hold on. So remember, he had been with Dean Quarle since he was 12 years old. Dean Quarle had been S.A.ing him this whole time. So he built trust. He bought him gifts. He was able to manipulate him into staying quiet about him touching him. And he also lived there, and he looked up to Quarle. He thought he was like a father. So Quarle eventually says, you know what? I like little boys. Hey, why don't you bring some of your friends over to the house and I'm going to play with them, I guess kind of like he'd been doing with him. And he said, I'm going to give you $200 every time you do that. I'm not going to hurt him. I'm just going to play with them. I'm just going to have fun. So he goes along with it. He starts bringing his friends to his apartment. Um, so as you can imagine, when he saw that, he knew that that wasn't just playing with the boys. So Dean ends up buying him a Corvette for his silence. And he stays silent. He stays silent. He doesn't go tell anybody. He drives his Corvette around. Well, one day he would bring in his friend Elmer Wayne Henley. Now, Elmer Wayne Henley was meant to be another victim. But for some reason, Dean Quarle liked Elmer Wayne Henley. He liked him so much that he brought him in to the group. So now he had two boys out there bringing him their friends, bringing him young boys to the house. Keep in mind, he's not going out getting his hands dirty. These boys are bringing them like they're presents to him, and he's giving them $200 per boy. Elmer Wayne Henley was a little bit different than David Owen Brooks. Elmer Wayne Henley lived with his mother, but they were very, very poor. They didn't have a lot of money. They couldn't make ends meet. So it took a little while for Dean Quarle to convince Henley to start bringing in these boys, but he did. And he started paying him as well $200 for each boy. So Dean Quarle eventually comes clean to the boys that he's not in an SA rink, because he had initially told them he was in a S trafficking rink, and that's why he needed these boys. He comes clean and he says, "No, I want these boys. I do these horrible things to them, and y'all are going to help me dispose of these bodies." So they do. They go and they continue to bring in friends. Now, as you can imagine, boys are missing. Boys are missing from Houston. Boys are missing from Pasadena. Boys start missing. However, back in the 70s, they didn't have a term for serial killer. They didn't have a term. They didn't even talk to each other. There wasn't a database. There wasn't a missing persons database in Houston. So they didn't know that all these boys would be linked eventually. Eventually they would be linked together. But so how they dealt with missing teenagers back in that day, or young boys, the parents would come in and they would report their children. The police would say they're a runaway, or they're missing. That was it. Not taken, stolen, abducted, none of that. They were runaways or they were missing. Well, there was quite a few parents that said, "No, my son didn't run away. My son was on his way to the store. My son was in his, swim gear going to the pool. My son didn't run away." But all they could do was hang up posters, ask around the friends, ask the neighborhoods, and that's all the police could do as well. They would go around, talk to some friends, hang up some posters, and that's all they did. So how does Dean Quarle get caught? Well, Dean Quarle gets caught because of Elmer Wayne Henley. Now, a lot of people say that Elmer Wayne Henley was kind of like a hero in this case, but as you're going to see down the road, opinions are going to change about that. It was the night of August 8th, 1973, and Henley was out with two of his friends, Tim Curley and Rhonda Williams. They were out. They'd been out partying, having a good time, but neither of the kids wanted to go home. So Henley decided to invite them over to Dean's house to continue partying with him. Well, when he got there, when he got there, Dean was extremely, really, really ticked off because he had brought a chick to his house. But nevertheless, they continued to drink. It was said that they sniffed some substances and they all went to sleep. When they woke up, unbeknownst to all three of them, they are strapped to, one of his torture boards. They are bound and tied up. Henley goes to work on Quarle immediately. He starts talking to him, telling him, let me go, let me go. I want to help you. I want to help you in this torture that you're about to do to my friends. Let me go. So Quarle let him go. It was also said that Quarle had instructed him to go over to Rhonda Williams while he went to Tim Curley. So when Henley went over to Rhonda Williams, she told him, are you going to let him do this to us? And it was then when Henley kind of snapped out of this and said, I can't let you hurt my friends anymore. Quarle had a weapon beside him. He wait till he set it down, he grabs the weapon, and he shoots and kills Dean Quarle that night. 6 times he shot him. This happened about, I believe, at about 3:30 in the morning. And he called the police. And he told the police what he did. And the police came and brought him in for questioning. It was then that the police had no clue what was coming for them in this case. At 8:30 in the morning, Elmer Wayne Henley called and confessed what he had done to the police. The police would bring him in for questioning. At first, the police did not believe his story. He would tell him that Dean Quarle and he would lure boys in for him. He would torture the boys, and then he would go and help Dean Quarle dispose of these boys' bodies. Well, I mean, I think back then in the 70s, they hadn't really seen anything like this. And they didn't believe him. So he said, you know what? I'm going to take you to one of the locations I helped him bury the bodies. So they all load up and they go to a boat storage that is in Pasadena, Texas. They go into the boat storage and it's basically dirt floors. But as soon as they walk in, they see bicycles, shoes, hats, all kinds of things like that. So they start digging. And as they're digging, they come across these plastic bags. In these plastic bags, it smell is god-awful, they said. It was just awful. They opened the plastic bags, and the bodies of these boys had been dipped or covered in some sort of lime situation. They go to discover 17 boys buried in that boat storage. And it is said that Henley had kind of like a photographic memory. He knew where each boy was buried, and he knew the names of most of the boys. So this time, okay, they know that he's not lying. However, Henley did not give Brooks his name as being part of the gang of helping Dean Quarle. The next day is when Brooks's father would bring him in to the police station to confess what he knew about Dean Quarle. And he also said that he did not participate in any of the K-ings or R's of the boys, but he did help dispose of some of the bodies. So the boys then took the police to a second location. This would be in Sam Rayburn. And the boys would say that they would take and load up the body in the back of Dean's van or in his car, and they would go out there and fish for a couple of hours, and then they would bury the boys' bodies there as well. I forgot to add on this little bit of information about the boat storage. They said that Dean Quarle would visit the boat storage 2 to 3 times a week, and that recently he had inquired about getting a second boat storage because his first boat storage was becoming very crowded. In 1978, Henley's verdict would be overturned, is what they said. He would get a new trial because the jurors in his case were not sequestered, meaning they could go home, they would watch the news, they would see everything that was being reported. So, I mean, it took them less than an hour to come back with a guilty verdict for him. And it was the same for the second trial. They still came back with a 99-year sentences for Henley. David Owen Brooks passed away from COVID in 2020 while in prison. Elmer Wayne Henley is still in prison, but even from prison, he is still helping the police find more boys. They believe that Dean Quarle killed before he got the 2 boys to work for him. I mean, remember, he went back and he lived with his grandma for 2 years. So they're thinking that there's more bodies out there. And currently, Texas EquiSearch has been looking and digging behind Dean Quarle's old home in Pasadena, Texas. Now, why they never did this before, I'm not really sure. But that's what they are doing currently. They haven't found anything, but they were excavating the yard. Can you imagine? There's people living there and they're like, hey, we need to look in your backyard because there might be some dead bodies because of who lived here before. So that's what was going on now. Okay, so I've changed. No, it's a whole different day because I went to edit this, and this is my first video ever, and I've been lagging and dragging on this video because it takes a lot to want to make a video, and then it takes a whole lot to want to look at yourself and listen to your voice, and then upload a video. It takes even longer because you just nitpick yourself. And I'm using a phone. So my phone didn't record the middle part of my video, and it didn't record the end part of my video. So I'm having to re-record it. And I got a new phone. So let's just get right back into what it didn't record so I can kind of pop the cork off of this new video and just put it up, and then I can get down to business with my other videos. Okay, so we were going to go into the trial. So what happened was that the boys, they did confess to helping and aiding in all these horrific murders, but then they kind of went back on it, and they did do a written confession, but then once the lawyers got involved, they said, look, you know, they're young. Henley didn't even have parents with him when he wrote this confession. Brooks was also young. So they said they really didn't have an idea as to what they were writing and how the law played into their confessions. So they opted for a trial. Both the boys were tried separately. So they did, I believe they did Henley's trial first. I believe. Henley's trial, they would bring in Rhonda Williams and Tim Curley to the stand. Remember, those were the 2 friends that Henley had brought into Dean Quarle's home, and eventually he would kill Dean Quarle and end all of his killing sprees to save his friends. Rhonda Williams took the stand. She said yes, that Henley basically saved her life. She told the story just like he did. Tim Curley would take the stand. He would tell the same story. Eventually the jury did come back. I think they deliberated an hour, maybe? Something like that. They would come back and they convicted him on 6 counts of murder. So they gave him 6 99-year sentences. Now Brooks had Billy Wrightinger. He was the 3rd surviving victim of Dean Quarle's. Billy Wrightinger was a boy, he was a friend of Brooks. Brooks had convinced Dean Quarle to let Billy Wrightinger go. Billy Wrightinger shows up to give his testimony. He has like those grocery store brown bags. He has that over his head, and he has some circles cut out, here and here, to give his testimony. Because they were savage. They did not care. That boy's face would have been all over the news at 6, 9, 10, everywhere. And he was young, and he had his whole life ahead of him, and that's how they protected him. That's how they did not show his face. They did not want to spread this little boy's face everywhere. So he came in and he gave his testimony. They would sentence Brooks to 1 count of murder to 199-year sentence. So as they are in prison, Henley continues to work to try and help the police locate and find more missing boys' bodies. To give an up-to-date kind of thing, because this case is still going on, even as much as a few months ago. They're still looking for boys' bodies. They are still looking. They're still trying to identify. Okay, so back to the boys. They took the police to a third location in High Island, Texas. It is near the Bolivar Peninsula, and it is a beach. This is kind of the reason why I even started looking into this case. A little side note, my husband and I went this summer and stayed in a beach house in High Island. We were there, and we felt a little off. It was a house that had been refurbished. It was a really nice house, an older house. But we kind of had like an off vibe. It was really strange, and honestly, I couldn't wait to go home. But we were with some other people, so we decided we went to the beach. We played on the beach. We had some fun, came back to the house. We would hear noises in the night. I would get up to check. Nothing was there. The vibe felt off. Then when I get home, of course, from this little trip, what do? I turn on Texas True Crime Stories because, sorry, my phone's acting up. True Crime Stories because I'm a weirdo. And the Candyman comes up. And it comes up that the third burial site was on High Island. And I was like, oh my goodness. Ew. We were on the beach where bodies had washed up and they had buried bodies. And I don't know, it was just something that kind of intrigued me. And now I've kind of fallen down this rabbit hole. And it continues to keep going and going. So they go to High Island. They discover the boys disposed of in the same way. There you can see pictures. They have a lot of stills of Brooks and Henley together, smoking cigarettes, shirtless, pointing out on the beach where these bodies are. Back in those days, what you saw is what you got. They didn't blur out nobody's face. They didn't care how old they were. As a matter of fact, at the boat shed, photographers and media was all up in that boat shed, trampling in there, right up in the face of these bodies being uncovered and buried. So, they didn't really have any need for DNA or to preserve a crime scene back in those days. So it happened that a man named Josh Vargas decided he was going to do a sort of documentary on this case. And he went to Elmer Wayne Henley's mother. And he asked if he could go into Elmer Wayne Henley's room and look around. And his mother said, of course. She said the police never went to Elmer Wayne Henley's room and looked through anything, that she had just packed up his things in boxes. They are going through his boxes, and in one of the boxes they find a Polaroid of a boy that's handcuffed. They believe this to be possibly the 29th victim of Dean Quarle. They're not really sure, but I think what most people believe is that there are more boys. They just couldn't connect them back then. They didn't have, like I said, they didn't have the ability like they do now to get on the system and say, oh my gosh, there's 5 boys missing from Houston, there's 5 boys missing from Pasadena, all these boys are runaways. They all lived near the candy factory. They were all friends with David Owen Brooks or Elmer Wayne Henley. They didn't have that back then. But everything would start to change after this case. So I recently just watched a new documentary that they have on Hulu about the Candyman, Dean Quarle. And Stanton Dramalla was Dean Quarle's last known victim and the first victim to be found. Both his parents are the only set of living parents known to be alive right now. They may find more, but we're not sure yet. But watching them really, really tore my heart out because they said that it was so hard for them to have to go up every 2 to 3 years when Brooks or Henley would come up for parole. And they would have to go every 2 or 3 years separately and retell all of these things that they know happened to their son and the other children that he hurt, just so that they would not get paroled. And honestly, they were never going to get paroled. But also it did some good things, this case. It brought out a new law where these people can only come up for parole every 10 years. So now the victims at least get a little break from telling a story. And Stanton Dramalla was a very specific case that I really took heart to because these parents are so devastated that this happened to their son. He was a victim of Dean Quarle. He was very tall for his age, and he was collecting bottles because you could take bottles to the local store and recycle them, and they would give you money for these bottles. And his parents said he was trying to save up some money to take his girlfriend to the movies. And that day, his dad told him it was okay to go ride his bike and go collect some bottles. And Stanton's mother would say that she tried to tell him, please don't go, it's dark, I don't want you to go. And he was a tall boy, so he patted her on the head and he said, Mom, I'm going to be right back. But he never came back, and they never quit looking for him. They were one of those parents that knew that he wasn't a runaway, that something had happened. And they said they were so aggravated going into the police station, saying he's not a runaway and he's not missing. Something happened to our son. So they said they are not going to be around forever to continue to go back every 10 years, but that Stanton has a sister and she has agreed to go in every 10 years to make sure that Henley never gets probation. Okay, so in the documentary, they also have the forensic anthropologist. I think she was working in Houston when all of this had happened or after it happened. Anyway, her name is Shannon Derrick. And she was working in the medical examiner's office. She started really wanting to dig back into these cases. And she said that she had went and was going, since she's an anthropologist, was going to go look at the remains, the bones at this point. She said they were just in bags, sitting in an evidence room, and they were just bones. And she said, she was going to try to identify some of them that hadn't been identified yet. And she did end up, I believe, identifying 3 out of the 4 boys that were unidentified. There's still 1 boy that they cannot identify. There's going to be a picture, I'll put it up, of what they believe he looked like, but they don't have DNA, they don't have anything to go on. So it's just kind of like if somebody sees him or somebody knows of him. He was wearing some things that were very distinctive to him. He was wearing a Catalina swimsuit. He was wearing some sort of shirt that was indicative of someone that was possibly in the army. And it's a very unusual. I will put a picture in of it so that you can just kind of get an idea. I don't know, maybe somebody will know something. But she is still looking for that. However, she did say she received a package in the mail, and it was a brown envelope addressed to her. And inside of it were some Polaroid pictures of a boy that was tied up. She said that they claimed that the boy's name was Bobby French, and that Dean Quarle had killed that boy 15 minutes after the picture was taken. However, she doesn't really know if she believes if that boy is Bobby French or not. She's still looking and digging for clues, and hopefully she'll figure out who the last remaining boy is, so you can put some, that name to rest, or him in his proper burial spot. Okay, so I kind of wanted to wrap up this video with, all true crime interests me. I kind of like to think about why evil exists. I kind of want to figure out, like, what happened to these people to make them be this way. Were they born this way? What mental illness did they have? Because in my mind, I can't ever fathom the thought of being this evil or having this evil inside me. So I'm always asking myself, like, what could have possibly have happened to this person to make them this terrible? So I grew up right front and center near all this drama. Very close, very, very close to this candy factory. I grew up when this case, I was born when this case came to light. So I grew up with some very, very strict parents. Strict as in protective is what I mean to say. I grew up in the era when the Don't Approach Vans came out. Don't Take Candy from Strangers came out. Don't Talk to Strangers came out. Stay Away from Men That Are Strangers came out. Don't Go Anywhere Alone Without Your Friends, without somebody else's parent. You're not going to go to somebody else's house unless we know their parents. Those kinds of things. And I would always be like, oh my gosh, why are you so paranoid? What's going on? And I would always just think that, oh, they're so overprotective of me. What's going on? But I didn't really know that, I didn't know that they knew. I mean, they knew that evil existed in this world because it happened. They lived through this story. My mother was a reporter. She worked for the newspapers. She was a journalist. She was a photographer. So, as you can imagine, she was front and center for all of this. She never really told me these stories. She would just tell me things like, just because someone looks nice doesn't mean that they're nice. Just because someone wants to give you things doesn't mean that they're nice people. So I don't think she wanted me to be paranoid or think the worst of people. So she never really told me these stories, but she would just kind of instill that in me to think, about people, not always in this great light that everybody's great in this world, even though I kind of do that still. So I grew up in this time. So it kind of didn't ruin my childhood, but it really, really, really made my parents extra, extra, extra careful with me and all my friends' parents as well. So I also was wondering now if this had happened, would the boys would they have been given treatment, or would they have just been thrown in prison? They were young. They were very young. Would they have been seen as evil as they were? Would it have been looked into as maybe like a Stockholm syndrome type thing? I mean, he kind of did brainwash them. He took advantage of the fact that they were forgotten children. He bribed them. He got their trust. He abused them. He took advantage of these boys. I'm not trying to excuse their behavior, but I'm trying to figure out, could they have been given any grace for the fact of their young age? They were so taken advantage of. A lot of people said that they became evil, or Brooks said that Henley, he could see him turning evil. He could see him starting to like this evilness. But if you are in this evil environment, do you start to turn